we have to think about the transformation of labor relations in relation to the rise of labor movements themselves, right? Over more kind of diverse diverse forms of organizing, labor organizing. So beyond the formal organizing of the traditional unions, we have to then now think increasingly towards the less organized. And I don't mean that in the kind of formalist sense. I mean it in terms of this was the earlier question I was addressing in my talk, was how do we think of organizing when our demands are not very clearly articulated to the question of exploitation? So, these labor constituencies, including peasant struggles, the struggles of informal workers or informalized workers, these are certainly indicative of the reconstitution of labor. The fact that we are seeing an emergence of an ever diverse kind of forms of organizing around labor questions are indicative of the reconstitution of labor, and secondly, are indicative of the pervasiveness of the distress that is being visited on workers in the global south. And secondly, a significant question facing scholars and organizing or activism then is not as much, I think my sense is not as much that labor relations are significantly shifting, but rather what is the nature of the social forces at play, and how do we organize around them? And lastly, again, as I was talking about earlier, there is a deepening of contradictions on the basis of gendered labor, which suggests both a greater integration of women into the global political economy, albeit on still very highly unequal terms, and also the likelihood that economic and political responses are not actually accounting for these contradictions. So these different questions have, of course, implications not just for policy, but also if you're thinking in terms of a path towards kind of democratic path towards socialism, for instance, we cannot think of these, or these, such a path must necessarily reflect the social constitution of the people, of the working people, or reconstitution of transformed labor. So in a sense, I'm saying that there are many signs, even when the labor classes that are being reconstituted and the way in which the relations are being reconstituted are not always clearly discernible. There are these struggles that we need to pay attention to. Where are they emerging? And there are these contradictions around the gendered labor question that we need to be paying attention to. The fundamental point is that all three main classes of labor that we see in the agrarian South, what we might call agrarian classes, which includes the wage labor, which includes petty commodity producers, and includes the peasantry. all three of these classes are not able, under the current conditions of capitalism, to sustain household consumption in isolation from each other. And so we can no longer actually understand them apart from each other. This is one. Second, and fundamental to the agrarian question, is the centrality which land and landed resources, including the commons, the commons and, which include forests, nature, the centrality that these land and landed resources assume in the daily production and reproduction of agrarian households, right? The major shift, and this is important, the major shift is that these sort of combination, this kind of copy of livelihood strategies that are all in some way dependent on nature, are primarily now aimed towards survival, right? And we cannot yet think about them in relation to the potential for industrialization. In a sense, we are saying it's not really a regression, it's just that the current conditions of capitalism, that capitalism visits on the workers, these different classes of workers on whom it depends, are so dire, are so immiserating, that we are at a place where the question that we have to pose, in fact, afresh, is how are people surviving? How are people surviving, not just now in the absence of sufficient wages, but also in the absence of, amidst an ongoing and quite unrelenting large-scale dispossession of land, these new rounds of primitive accumulation. So lastly, even if we were to move beyond the survival mode, and this again is really important in thinking through the gendered labor as an agrarian question, even if we were to move beyond this survival mode, the centrality of gendered labor in these processes of social reproduction is such that it has to be concretely addressed, and its contradictions must be resolved. And a major one is just this, the question of gender inequity that is so deeply embedded in gendered labor. So even if we are to move from that, we have to deal with this question of inequity. So in a bid to resolve the agrarian question, or to settle, if we are to settle at all, the agrarian questions facing the global south today. This question of survival requires a rethinking of what is considered as politics itself. Remember that historically, the agrarian question deals with there's a social component to it. There's a political, it's political expression. There's its economic expression. And I think that part of the difficulty with the question of survival, for most theorists, agrarian theorists, is that, and this question emerged earlier in the earlier discussion, is that where do we place exploitation? How do we deal with this concretely, right? So I think that we have to really rethink, we have to think about it as a political question, first and foremost. It is an economic question, obviously, that's what we're saying, but we also have to think about it as a, what is considered politics itself. Does the question of survival constitute a concrete enough problem that we can organize around the way that we organize around the question of exploitation? And I think this is really where we are sitting.